When I think about these ideas of civic engagement and citizenship, I often reflect on my own childhood growing up in Cleveland. I grew up in a tough community with my mom and my grandma. And I vividly remember my grandma had a sign on her door to scare away the drug dealers that were hanging out in our front yard. And the sign said, "I don't dial 911," with a picture of a gun. Now, scared away the drug dealers and scared away a few girlfriends, I might say. But it was a very passionate form of civic action. And her pride for her community inspired her and her neighbors to start these neighborhood block clubs where they would come and meet in our living room and talk about what were the biggest problems facing our community. And just like my grandma inspired me to have a passion for public service, Philip Randolph inspired a generation of civil rights leaders to fight for equality and opportunity. Philip Randolph was one of the foremost labor rights activists of our time. And in the early 1940s, there were about 250,000 jobs that were shut out to blacks in the defense industry. So knowing this problem, Mr. Randolph went to go talk to President Roosevelt. And he said, "Mr. President, I need your help. We have to integrate the defense industry for blacks. This is a matter of social justice." In response, FDR said, "Mr. Randolph, hey, I agree with you. Politically, it's tough, but I agree with you. Now go make me do it." So, Mr. Randolph took that charge, and he mobilized over 100,000 people for a protest in front of the White House. And one of the advisors to President Roosevelt at the time said, "Hey, Mr. President, we got to do something because if these folks show up on our front door, it's going to be devastating to your presidency." And weeks later, FDR signed an executive order integrating the defense industry for blacks. And Philip Randolph had an important civic success. So, what does this mean for cities? Folks like to say that demography is our destiny. And when it comes to cities, by 2050, a majority of the world's population will be in cities. So from Shanghai to New York City, it's going to be important for city leaders to understand how do they leverage the importance of civic engagement and civic voice in a public policy, because it's not just good politics, it's also good economics. But we haven't really took a really deep look at understanding the role that civic voice and civic engagement actually has on economic development, right? If you're a city leader right now creating public policy or economic development policy, you're looking at tax incentives or building new buildings or building stronger industries. But rarely do city leaders calculate the behavioral economics of place. How do attitudes and perception drive economic vitality? Well, there's some new data on this. Through the work of the U.S. Census and the National Conference on Citizenship, they did a fascinating study that actually looked at the role that civic engagement plays in driving local economic development, especially as it relates to unemployment. So they looked at civic engagement through various factors: voting, how many neighbors work together to solve local problems, how many folks in the community volunteer, how do you access information. And in the majority of some cities, they found that there was a strong association between civic engagement and the resilience against local unemployment rates. So 2 extreme case studies you see here. Las Vegas experienced some of the highest unemployment rates between 2006 and 2010. And they had some of the lowest rates of neighborhood volunteerism rates. However, you look at St. Paul, Minneapolis, they had some of the highest rates of volunteer participation and experienced some of the lowest unemployment rates between 2006 and 2010. Again, we find that cities that had the highest volunteer rates in 2006 also experienced the smallest level of unemployment increase between 2006 and 2010. So again, civic engagement plays a huge role in the economic vitality of place. Another key data point we found in the study was that if you could actually increase the volunteer rate in the community by just 1%, they showed that that could actually decrease unemployment by 0.1%. So, again, as city leaders think about how to make their economy successful, it's going to be critical that they actually include civic voice in their economic development strategies. You know, the other day I was reading an editorial by Mayor Bloomberg in the Financial Times, and he talked about the importance of talent. And he says that talent attracts capital, not the other way around. And as we think about all the economic development projects we have right here in Cleveland and other cities across the world, it's going to be very important that we figure out how do we engage city leaders in understanding that us as talented citizens, as creative citizens, we want to know that we can make change. And we feel like this is a place where we can't make change, we'll go somewhere else. And until city leaders calculate civic voice and civic engagement to their bottom line, it will not drive economic competitiveness. So if my grandma didn't step up, our community would have suffered. If A. Philip Randolph didn't step up, the civil rights movement would have been dramatically impacted by that. And so we as citizens have to create the right conditions for civic engagement and civic change. We are the ones we've been waiting for. And a lot of times we get caught up in this Calvary mindset that we're waiting on the Messiah to solve our problems, waiting on this great leader to solve our problems. But it's up to us to make that change. We have to create the right conditions for civic voice and civic change.